Every year for the last 5 or so years, I've found myself returning to Polaris. The old RX 470, 480 and their derivatives were cheap, widely available used graphics cards that had that famous AMD staying power and offered excellent performance compared to what the new market had to offer. In 2023, however, cracks have started to show in the Polaris meta, leaving room in the market for a sub £150 GPU that can run anything you throw at it. Well, I think I've found a new contender. The RX 5600 XT was the middle child of AMD's first RDNA series GPUs, launched 103 years ago at the beginning of 2020 for a price of about £250. RDNA marked AMD's first departure from a GCN architecture in almost a decade. Whereas GCN powered the 8th console generation, ensuring great support in games throughout the PS4 and Xbox One era, RDNA would go on to power the 9th gen. It's a reasonable bet then that any graphics cards based on this newer architecture are gonna hold up for a few years. Like Polaris, these first-gen RDNA cards are finding their way to the used market in large quantities, having been sold off en masse by ex-crypto miners. The RX 5600 XT can be had on AliExpress for as little as £120, cheaper than the woeful RX 6400 and 6500 XT and the comparatively tame GTX 1650. And that's exactly where I got mine. This Sapphire Pulse triple fan model seems to have been exclusive to the Asia market, but cooler aside, it doesn't seem all that different from the regular Pulse model. My specific card did exhibit some of the things one needs to be wary of when buying on AliExpress. One of the fans was making a bit of a racket, so I unplugged it to save myself a headache. Also, the thermal paste needed replacing, and several of the screws showed signs of rust. I guess if you can find a similar price on eBay or a local market, you might take that as a sign that you should give AliExpress a miss, though I admit this probably won't be the last card I buy from them. I just don't learn. Wherever you get yours from, there's plenty to be excited about, with support for DX12-1, a feature set we didn't know we needed until quite recently, and a modest 6GB frame buffer. The 5600 XT could be exactly the budget 1080p card that the market needs in 2023. I'll be putting mine through its paces in 13 modern games using the moderately priced gaming PC. The MPG PC was just revamped to include Gen 4 PCI Express and 32GB of RAM, though I plan on running Windows 10 until it's no longer an option. Starting with Atomic Heart, I noted in my GTX 1650 review that there's a steep drop between performance at 1080 low and medium. That GPU wasn't really up to scratch at any higher settings, but the 5600 XT most definitely is. Alas, that steep drop-off still remains. At 1080 medium, the game can almost manage a 120 FPS average. Of course, you don't really need an esports level experience in a game that's more System Shock than CSGO, so you'd probably want to push quality up to high to enjoy those sumptuous, not at all disturbing visuals. However, that will cut frame rates almost in half. The RX 5600 XT can still manage a 60 FPS average, however, and it's worth bearing in mind that the game's many interior scenes are less demanding than this. Microsoft's first-party titles are a natural fit for the 5600 XT, and Forza Horizon 5 is no exception. At 1080 high, it's possible to see over 100 FPS, even in the very intensive built-in benchmark. Turning up to Ultra has a heavy impact on frame rates, but the 5600 XT can still manage a 70 FPS average. I wouldn't recommend Extreme, as the game will need more than 6GB of VRAM and has a tendency to nag you about it. 1440 high can push 86 FPS, but I think that's probably as high as you're likely to get, quality-wise. Not all Xbox-featured titles are so snappy, however. A Plague Tale Requiem is a pretty demanding title, though in fairness it does at least look the part. If you're aiming for close to 60 FPS, you probably need to think about using FSR, as I did. At 1080 medium with FSR quality, the game actually averages over 75 FPS, with a 1% low close to 60. As this is arguably a title that could stand to run at a lower frame rate, turning up to high maintains an average above 60, but we'll see dips below that during more intensive moments. Halo Infinite loves RDNA, and RDNA loves Halo. This is the Xbox architecture in the Xbox mascot title after all, so it should be thoroughly unsurprising to see the game running at 70 FPS averages at 1080 high settings. That being said, Halo is still one of the more unreasonably demanding games so far this generation, so 1080 low only manages 100 FPS. Reaching 120 or 144 in outdoor scenes and big team battles is going to require some judicious application of resolution scaling. Honestly, outside of my CPU benchmarks, I haven't spent a whole lot of time with Spider-Man Remastered, and I entered this review without really knowing what to expect. As it turns out, quite a lot. At 1080 high, the 5600 XT can push almost 100 FPS on average, or a little under double what the GTX 1650 managed. Turning up to very high sees a reduction of less than 10% on average, which is a surprisingly small impact, though I think if you're playing on a smaller screen you might struggle to notice the difference anyway. Again, this is a title that can stand to be turned up to 1440p without any need for resolution scaling, averaging just over 60 FPS and only really dropping at the point in the benchmark where the whole of Manhattan is visible. To be on the safe side, it would only take a drop to high or the addition of some FSR or IGTI to keep things running smoothly. After the success of Spider-Man, I went into Uncharted with a little more confidence. I decided to skip lower quality settings altogether and jumped straight in at 1080 Ultra. My benchmark run turned in a very tidy 85 FPS, with lows in the 70s, which should give you more than enough headroom for those more action-heavy set pieces. Once more, if you want to turn up to 1440, it is possible, though unfortunately not at ultra quality. I dropped to high settings and still kept a 60 FPS average with 53 FPS 1% lows, so owners of 1440p displays might wish to use some upscaling to guarantee a 60 FPS lock. God of War doesn't drop the ball here. Performance is still very good at 1080, with original quality beating 100 FPS on average. Ultra settings isn't quite possible for one main reason: VRAM. Both the previous Sony titles indicated they would be low on VRAM at max settings, but God of War's Ultra settings passed 6GB. Dropping to high does the trick and still runs at 85 FPS on average, and with lows still well above 60. Once more, 1440 is doable, but I'd only suggest using the original preset. This is still well under the 6GB limit and can produce 70 FPS on average, so you might find there's room to tweak settings slightly and turn up the texture and shadow quality. Of course, it's not all sunshine and handjobs, and Cyberpunk had to go and spoil things. I don't know if I missed something, but when I tested the Vega 56 last year, it actually got higher numbers than this, even without overclocking. I suspect that means CDPR have been tinkering with the quality presets again, because the RX 5600 XT had so far been doing really well. 1080 medium just fails to make a 60 FPS average, though granted only on a technicality. This is 10 FPS less than a stock Vega 56 managed last year. 1080 high only manages 50 FPS, and while this is of course the naturally perfect frame rate, don't at me, you might want to add some FSR to appease our NTSC overlords. On the absolute flip side of this, Witcher 3's remaster kinda blew me away. I'd been expecting a much worse experience based on what I'd seen with the GTX 1650, but either this is a heavily Radeon favoured title, or the 4GB VRAM limit was a bigger issue than I thought, but the 5600 XT more than quadruples that card's frame rate at 1080 high, averaging 94 FPS. I had to double check my settings. Of course, this means there's more than enough room to push further. At 1080 Ultra, the 5600 XT can still reach over 80 FPS, and 1440 high can exceed 60 FPS on average. Of course, you might expect playable frame rates in ugly games like the ones I've featured so far, but the majesty of Forspoken requires something a bit more potent. Nah, I'm kidding, there's no reason why this game's so demanding, but here we are. At 1080 standard quality, the game only sees 42 FPS on average, and this could potentially drop way further in heavier action scenes. Adding FSR quality comes close to a 60 FPS average, but doesn't quite hit it. Going lower than FSR-Q from 1080 is going to look pretty rough, so I'd probably recommend steering clear of that if possible. I kinda ran out of time for testing Overwatch 2, so I only got a single match in at 1080 Epic. I'm sure you could get a high refresh experience with this card by dropping to Ultra or High, and honestly, the visuals don't suffer all that much. As it is, at 1080 with maxed out settings, the game runs at a still silky smooth 114 FPS. I've worked out a new routine for testing Fortnite on graphics cards. In DX12 I'll do one pass at 1080 low with epic view distance and 100% resolution scaling, the so-called competitive settings. Then I'll do another pass at 1080 medium, again at 100% scaling, which is certainly more visually impressive without turning on anything that would overly hurt frame rates. And finally at high settings, which in this case includes such demanding settings as Nanite and Lumen. At competitive settings, the 5600 XT is blazing fast, churning out almost 270 FPS on average. This would be a great pairing for a 1080p 240Hz panel. At medium, things look pretty, but frames have taken a beating. 163 FPS is still extremely playable, especially if, like me, you have a 144Hz display, but it's a big drop from low. High, however, is an even bigger drop. At 1080 you can expect barely a 60 FPS average, and Fortnite's standard stutter is still gonna ruin your day. What's worse, the newly deepened shadows make the game actually harder to play well, so I probably wouldn't recommend this even if the game were running at 120 FPS rather than 60. I've established that, in my opinion at least, there's basically bugger all practical difference between Warzone 2's basic and balanced settings in terms of visual quality, so I skipped balanced for this test. Basic can provide a little below a 120 FPS experience, so anyone looking for a GPU to keep up with a higher refresh monitor than your standard 60 or 75Hz model will probably want to consider turning on XeSS. Those looking for a bit more fidelity and who are happy with 60 FPS should be perfectly satisfied with Ultra, as the average only drops into the mid-80s and shadows look way less blocky. If you were in the market for a sub £150 GPU this year, and maybe don't mind travelling the slightly more uncertain waters of the used market, the RX 5600 XT should definitely be on your shortlist. Considering that the RX 5500 XT still sells for only 10 to 20% less than this, and people still expect to sell the vastly inferior RX 6500 XT for more money, I consider this a bit of a no-brainer. The only question that might be raised is whether you can afford to spend a little more. If you can justify the step up to £180 to £200, there are a couple more interesting AMD options, one of which I'll be looking at in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.